Chapter 6 deals with nurturing and control and looks at the specific communication interactions that characterize the raising of healthy children in terms of body, mind, and emotions. In general, most parents and caregivers desire that their children will be healthy and will develop in an optimum way in terms of their physical development, their intellectual competence, their emotional development, and of course, their social proficiency. So, in terms of physical development, parents and caregivers do a good deal in terms of keeping their children safe on a daily basis, keeping their children away from cars or away from the road where it might be dangerous, or away from a stove that may be hot. So in terms of keeping our children healthy and safe, this is one of the reasons why people have many rules for their children in terms of what children can and cannot do. For example, why is it that children are always told, don't talk to strangers? That rule is because of the physical health of the child. We know that if a child talks to strangers, that the chances that they will be abducted are much greater. And so this is why oftentimes children are taught not to talk with strangers so that they can avoid these kinds of compromising situations. Likewise, when parents have their children eating in a healthy way on a regular basis, including fresh fruits and vegetables, healthy grains, lean meats, and low-fat dairy, things like that, then parents are really training their children for the way that they will eat for the rest of their life. So, if you provide a healthy eating environment and healthy eating modeling for your children, and you teach them how to make fresh and healthy and low-fat meals that are high in protein and things like that, then it's often likely that your children will also grow up to value healthy eating, and they will strive to eat healthy themselves. When we teach our children to exercise or to go play ball or to go play at the park, we are instilling the value of activity and healthy physical activities. And those healthy physical activities allow us to have a physical body that is strong and allows us to not be in a situation where we develop a weight problem at a young age. And so the combination of healthy eating and, of course, physical exercise ensures that we can train our children to be healthy and to have lifelong habits that will take them through their lives in a much more healthy way than if they are taught to eat and rely on fast food and processed food that is very low in nutrition and high in fat and sodium. So as parents, it really is our responsibility to take the physical health of our children into our hands and train them to be healthy individuals. Likewise, intellectual development is something that all parents want of their children. So for instance, this is why parents send their children to preschool in order to get a head start. Or this is why children have a value, most parents have a value that their children will attend school on a regular basis and will complete homework and will participate in the class. These values are based on intellectual development. Also, when parents read to their children, or when parents have books in the home or encyclopedias in the home or computers in the home that children are able to use to develop their intellectual competence, these are all ways that we can help our children to be intellectual individuals and to be healthy intellectually. Also, in terms of education, many parents want their children nowadays to go to college so that they can get a decent job and become gainfully employed at some point. And so it is often the parent's role to discuss issues related to college with their children and to help the children get into college by helping them with the application and by helping them pay for college. So these are all ways that parents can help their children to develop intellectually. And ultimately, it is up to the parents to model that they value things like intellectual stimulation and that they value things like education. Because if the children watch the parents and see that the parents value intellectual development and intellectual accomplishment, then the children will also learn to value that as well. Emotional competence is something that all people need. And, in fact, people that have emotional competence tend to go farther in terms of their career and their social engagement than people that do not have good emotional skills. In fact, some of the leading research on career development and accomplishment suggests that people who are gifted in terms of their emotional competence tend to go farther than people that are only gifted in terms of their intellectual competence. What this suggests is that although intellectual competence is very important for development and accomplishment in life, emotional and social competence are also extremely important. So, in terms of emotional health, we can train our children to have good emotional habits by being a good model for them and by teaching them how to deal with their emotions. So, we can model that when there's a conflict, that mom and dad stay calm, and if they're not calm, they go somewhere for 10 minutes to get calm before they talk about the issue. When they talk about the issue, our children could gain a lot from us if they learn that we can talk about feelings like frustration or sadness or anger without actually having to vocally demonstrate that we are angry. And so also with related to issues like control and aggression, if our children see us staying calm during times of conflict or pressure, then it is likely that they will also tend to develop in that way in terms of their emotional competence. So emotional competence is really about teaching our children how to manage their emotions so that when they deal with difficult issues in their lives, they don't lose emotional control and either get themselves into very difficult situations because they lost emotional control, or prevent themselves from accomplishing their career success or their personal success because they're not able to keep control when they need to. Sometimes people don't have the emotional skills that they may need to teach their children, and in these cases it's always wise to enlist the help of a professional counselor who can teach you the kinds of emotional skills that you may need or that may be better for you. And once you are able to learn these skills, then you can start to model them for your children, and then you can talk to them about the best way to deal with situations that are emotional so that they can learn how to be emotionally competent. Also, social competence or social interactions are things that children learn from their parents. So, if children have parents who are very outgoing and interactive and open and receptive, then it's likely that children will also be more like that. And in terms of social interactions, it is primarily the responsibility of the parent to socialize children in terms of how to play nicely with other people, how to respect authority figures who may not be the parents, what kinds of social behaviors are appropriate in certain situations, and how to manage various social interactions. So parents do a good deal to ensure that their children develop in a healthy way in terms of physical, intellectual, emotional, and social development. One of the important definitions that we'll be drawing from in this chapter deals with responsiveness, or the expression of warmth. Now, as parents, we have a responsibility to communicate with our children in a way that is warm, so that they know that we love them and that we care about them, but also we need to be clear with them about what our expectations are. And so one of the ways that we can be clear is by having open communication in terms of the fact that we are their parents, we care a lot about them, we want the best for them, right? We're their friends, we're doing everything that we do basically for their success. And in doing this, we are able to reach out to our children to demonstrate that we care enough to be honest with them about the fact that we love them and also the fact that we have expectations for them in terms of their behavior. Another thing that we can do to convey responsiveness or warmth is to have a focus on person-centered discourse when we communicate with our children. Person-centered discourse deals with, as the title suggests, or as the phrase suggests, deals with really getting at what that person is experiencing, going through, and having a conversation that will meet the needs that that person has at that point in time. So, for instance, if you can read your child and you can tell that they had a rough day at school, if you were drawing from person-centered discourse, what you would do would be to set aside some time when you feel like they'll be open to talking. Perhaps you might talk with them over dinner if they're receptive to that. Other times, maybe doing things together may be a good time to talk, because then you don't have to look each other in the eye or in the face to talk about the issue. So maybe if you're playing ball, or maybe if you're doing a hobby together, or going for a walk together. One of my friends always tells me that the best way to have a difficult conversation with her kids is to do it in the car, because there is something very comforting to kids or teenagers about having a conversation with their parents in the car, because they don't actually have to make eye contact with their parents, and so there's less of a pressure, I think, on the children in terms of having challenging conversations when basically their parents are driving, so they're kind of focused on something else, and the conversation is something that is more of a side thing. So you can try that if you have children and see if that works for you. But going back to person-centered discourse, really when you are engaging this type of a strategy, you are really striving to convey to someone that they matter to you, that you care about what their experience is and how they're feeling, and that really you're trying to do everything that you can do to try to make whatever the problem is, have it be resolved, or to have it work out in a better way. Also, we should strive to be very open to our children when they come to us to communicate. So if your children are reaching out in terms of a need for affection, if they try to hug you, it's probably really wise to confirm that reaching out and reciprocate a hug if that's what they're looking for. Or if they're looking for a conversation and they want to talk about school or a relationship they have, or a friendship, or some kind of issue they're dealing with, it's really in our best interest as parents to demonstrate to our children that we are there for them when they need us. Because if our children know that they can come to us when they have problems, then we can make sure that they don't go to the wrong individuals for comfort or for solutions. Another major aspect of being a good parent is, of course, the demand and the control dimension. And control and demand may deal with confrontation in some cases. Perhaps your children may violate certain rules or expectations that you've established for them. And so in these situations, we can be demanding and we can assert control in a way that is still warm. So we can tell our children why they are losing certain privileges, or why they cannot go and spend the night at their friend's house this weekend, or why they don't get to go to a certain event. And we tell them this so that they are clear and they understand why it is that they are losing a privilege, but we also explain to them why it's important that they learn the lesson that they need to learn. And so I encourage you, when you are in a position of control and warmth, to work on trying to use logic and reasoning with your children rather than corporal punishment, because you may be surprised at how reasonable children can be if they are given the opportunity to develop a mature conversation about the issue, and you may even have them helping you resolve the issue by coming up with ideas themselves. So in terms of demand, although we do have to assert control and demand, we do not have to be aggressive or extremely dominating in the way that we do it. And in some cases, you may actually engage in some monitoring. So for instance, many of you in the class may have children who are in pre-adolescent or teenage years, and one of the main things that parents are concerned about nowadays in terms of their safety of their children is the issue of technological predators or online predators, or these people that find them on Facebook or other social networking sites. And so in terms of trying to protect your child, you may actually engage in monitoring with what they are doing on the computer, who they're talking with, and you may have a very open and frank conversation with them about the fact that they need to be very careful about the kinds of information that they post on these websites, because they are publicly available. So obviously you would not want your children to post anything about their address, or even maybe the town they live in, or the school they go to, or who their friends are, things like that. So it's good to engage in monitoring in some situations, but obviously you don't want to go overboard. So if you give your 8-year-old daughter a journal and you say that she can write anything she wants in the journal because it's very private, and then she discovers later that you've been reading her journal, obviously that would not be a good use of monitoring, because your child might never trust you again if you did that. But in terms of the internet, you might even tell your child that you will be engaging in monitoring so that they are aware of the fact that whatever they do at home on the computer will be seen. So it's up to you in terms of what you monitor and how you actually confront your children. But in terms of confrontation, typically it's good to stay calm, to use very I-centered language. So, when this behavior happens, I find that I feel worried about you, I feel concerned as a parent, things like that. And the best thing that you can do to ensure that your children understand the rules and will abide by your rules is to have consistent discipline. When children have consistent rules that are consistently enforced, what they learn is that if they violate rules, there is a logical consequence. And what this will do for your children, if you provide consistent discipline, is it will allow them to abide by the necessary rules and laws that high-functioning individuals need to abide by. So, for instance, the rules and laws at school, the rules and laws at a job, the rules and laws in terms of the government and legal issues. So it's very important to be consistent. If your children learn that they can get out of discipline by trying to talk with you in a certain way or by using manipulation such as temper tantrums or other types of power issues, then what they learn is that basically they just have to be good at manipulating to get out of discipline. So the best thing that you can do for your children is to provide warm and firm discipline that you consistently enforce with a set of consistent rules over time. By communicating with your children from both nurturing and control stances, you will be enabling them to develop in terms of their physical development, their socio-emotional development, and of course their intellectual development. So, showing your children that you care about them by hugging them and showing affection, or teaching them how to manage their emotions is an essential part of nurturing behavior. Also, feeding our children healthy food, making sure they get the right sleep and exercise is another component of nurturing our children to be healthy physically. And also, intellectual development is related to helping our children with their assignments, being encouraging with them in terms of their own assignments, and teaching them basically that they can take on something and learn about something new and they can do a good job. On the other hand, demand and control issues are very important as well. So we need to communicate our expectations to the children in terms of what kinds of rules they should follow. Also, when children deviate from the expected rules or behavior, we need to reinforce this behavior through firm but kind punishment. And finally, through using an appropriate type of control and discipline tactic, we will be able to teach our children the importance of following rules and adapting to the norms of the system with which they are living. As we've been discussing this semester, nurturing is a major component of the physical development stages that children progress through. And in terms of the physical health of a child, this domain tends to be primarily handled by mom or women in the home. So, for instance, doctor's visits, shots, any kind of medications that children may need, women tend to be more active in this domain in terms of the physical health nurturing of the child. This is probably also because of the fact that women still tend to be the primary caregivers in most homes, and this would help us to understand why it is that mom tends to be the one that takes people on the regular doctor's visits, because usually she is the one that is typically around the children on a daily basis for most of the day. Now, in terms of encouraging activity and health, fathers tend to be more instrumental in this domain. So, for instance, fathers may be more active in terms of teaching their children how to ride their bicycle, or in terms of taking them to play tennis or to play golf. They may also engage in wrestling and tumble play with their children. And in terms of a playmate, dads tend to be more of the playmates with their children than moms do. In terms of sexual health of children, this is also something that is very important for parents to take into consideration when they're raising their adolescent children, or even pre-adolescent children nowadays. And as we mentioned as we have mentioned before, mom tends to be more of the person that children tend to go to talk about issues that are more compromising or more personal. However, in some cases, there is not a female role model in the home, so in those situations, dad may have to be the person to have conversations with their kids about sexual health, about not giving in to pressure, peer pressure to have sex, about how to prevent any kind of STDs or pregnancy from taking place if children are engaging in sexual health or sexual activity. So it really is up to the parents to make sure that their children have the information that they need to keep themselves physically healthy. And physical health includes good eating, physical activity, and obviously taking good care of yourself in a physical way so that you do not contract any kinds of detrimental situations or diseases or have any negative outcomes based on sexual activity. Socio-emotional development is also very important in terms of raising healthy children. And so socio-emotional development deals with the ability of your child to be accepted by their peers and to fit in with their friends and to be liked by their peers. And what's very intriguing about socio-emotional development among children is that when children have parents who are more responsive to them, and we've talked about responsiveness already, when children have parents who are more responsive to them, these children actually tend to be more popular growing up. However, when children have parents who are less responsive, then these children tend to exhibit that they are less popular in social interactions, and clearly these kinds of tendencies may carry with the child throughout the course of their life. So in terms of coaching your child how to have good social interactions, mom tends to coach 3 to 5-year-olds often, and dads do too. And so part of this coaching tends to basically sound like this. Now, Johnny, you know you shouldn't have hit Bobby to get the toy away from him. Why don't you go ask Bobby nicely if you can play with his toy, and then he will probably let you do it. And so Johnny will walk over to Bobby and say, Bobby, I'm sorry for hitting you. Will you please let me play with your toy? And in this way, mothers and fathers are able to coach their young children how to be socially acceptable so that they can be more popular with their peers later on in life. Now, on the other hand, parents do a good deal to influence their children in terms of their gender or sex role development. So, the way in which mom models to her young daughter that she is a woman will often be the way in which a daughter perceives she should be when she is older as well. Likewise, the way that father develops or demonstrates his role will also influence the way that their children develop in terms of male development. So it's very important that we are conscious of the ways in which we model how our children should develop in terms of gender. So what does this mean in terms of communication? Well, if we are a man, what this means is that we can model to our children that being a strong man means being someone who can communicate and have a good relationship with their partner, and that it means someone who can get along with their peers and do a good job at work. If a child sees their father in the home and dad exhibits aggressive, loud, verbal tendencies, then it is no surprise that a child who has a dad like that may grow up thinking that that's the way that boys or men should act, and so that child may adapt to that behavior. On the other hand, if we have a mom who is modeling for her young daughter how to be a woman, then there are things like body image, for instance, that can play out in the mind of a young child by watching their mother. So for instance, if a young daughter grows up and sees her mother having a very healthy body image, engaged in activity, eating healthy, and basically being very positive about her body, then we would also expect that that daughter that grows up seeing that behavior will also develop more of a positive image of their body as they progress into adulthood. On the other hand, if we see a mother acting in a way in front of their daughter where they are constantly self-criticizing and constantly talking about how fat they are or how this part of their body is not perfect or how they need to go on another diet to try to lose 20 pounds, or whatever, then we would expect that the daughter who watches their mother act like that would also take on a negative self-image in terms of body, and may also adapt to the types of physical interventions that perhaps mom does. So perhaps we might expect that the daughter would try to, engage in many diet programs to try to, become a very, very thin person, because she thinks that's what being a woman means, being thin, very thin, right? Also, in modern day times, we have a lot of people who are engaging in other types of physical interventions to try to make their bodies look better. So we have plastic surgery, Botox, all of these things. So it's very important that we model to our children how to be a man and how to be a woman, and that we do it in a way that's healthy so that our children develop healthy impressions of who they should be when they get older. Also, expressing emotion is something that people primarily learn from their parents. So it's up to you to make sure that your children learn that expressing emotions are okay, as long as they express them in a way that is mature and that is acceptable for the people around them. And this is something that children learn a good deal of from their parents. And so if you tend to be someone who has good emotional control and you tend to talk through conflicts calmly, then you can expect that your children will grow up and have a tendency to be like that as well. And they will have a tendency to be like that even in their childhood, because they will be watching you. However, if you tend to be someone who gets very upset very quickly, and you tend to vent on people around you, and you tend to assert verbal aggression towards your children a lot, then you can also expect that your children will grow up to become people that vent on the others around them and that exhibit verbal aggression or physical aggression. So it's very important how we teach our children to manage and express their emotions. And if you find that you are not particularly good at this, as I've said before, you can always go to counseling to learn how to manage your emotions more effectively, and of course you can teach your children how to do that as well. Academic development is another component of development, and this is related to intellectual development. And basically, education is really seen as a family duty in American society. And so one way that we can look at this is, for instance, by infant-directed speech. Infant-directed speech is speech or communication that parents or caregivers deliberately construct in order to attract the attention of the infant. And what's interesting is that parents seem to have almost an intuitive ability to stimulate their children's learning. Characteristics of infant-directed speech would include a higher pitch, shorter, emphatic words. It might also include exclamations or gasps, as well as musicality and rhythm. And these infant-directed speech tendencies tend to be cross-cultural, meaning that we tend to find that across various nations and cultures, people tend to engage in this type of interaction with their children. Language acquisition is also a part of academic development, and clearly if you talk with your children a lot and you are constantly reading them stories and helping them with the alphabet and getting them books or magazines or things that they find exciting, then you can promote better language acquisition for your children in terms of acquiring the English language. However, what they say about acquiring a second or third language is that if you want your children to be competent in more than one language, that your best bet is to start them on a new language by the time they are 3 or 4. Because if you start a child on a language at a very young age, they are more likely to adapt to the structure of that language than if you try to start your child on a language at 10 or 15 years of age. Obviously, academic development includes other things like reading, writing, arithmetic, and these are all things that we can be doing with our children at home by helping them with their homework. If they tend to have a problem with one of these areas, we can get them a tutor if we ourselves are not competent in teaching them how to do it. And when children begin to go to school, there are many skills that they develop at school which we can also assist them with. So one of these things would be, for instance, having good relationships with their peers. So we might ask our children, well, how are things going at school, and how are your friends doing? And do you like your classmates? And in this way, we can be very person-centered in talking with our kids about what their experiences are at school. And also, if our children have good experiences when they're at school socially, they will probably also do better in terms of their academic achievement than if they do not like going to school because they have a hard time dealing with their peers. So basically, children who have a good amount of support from their parents and a good amount and good modeling in terms of emotional expression and social integration tend to exhibit better peer relations, and they also tend to stay in school longer, so they have greater retention, and they also have greater graduation rates in terms of high school and college. So I cannot underscore enough the importance of parents in terms of the academic development of the child, and this is something that is constantly ongoing and something that parents tend to start to plan for even when the child is just an infant by putting money away for college or things like that. Out is the fact that although when she got beat by her father, she never went out and stayed out again, she also did not respect her father and did not feel a sense of closeness ever with her father because of the fact that he had such strict, forceful ways of implementing his authoritarian parenting rules and process. So we can see that although a benefit of authoritarian parenting may be that children are more submissive in the short term, in the long term, this parenting style tends to be met with less of a close relationship between the children and the parents. Also, in terms of child development, authoritarian parenting style is definitely not the ideal way. So, what research has actually found is that in situations where young children have authoritarian parents, they can tell, even at age 2 or 3, that these children are much more withdrawn and much more insecure than other 2- and 3-year-olds who have parents who are not authoritarian. Also, oftentimes authoritarian parenting is accompanied with a type of verbal aggression or physical aggression in terms of punishment, and so what the child depicts at a young age, even at the age of 2 or 3, is that they are more hostile towards their peers and towards others, and children who have authoritarian parents are also more hostile and aggressive towards other children and other social individuals. When children of authoritarian parents grow up to adolescence, they tend to engage in much more conflict than their peers who come from other parenting homes. They tend to exhibit lower self-esteem, they tend to have lower grades, and they tend to be less adjusted socially than the peers that they have who have parents who use a different style. In terms of satisfaction and communication, the authoritarian parenting style is the least effective and has the least satisfying rates of relational satisfaction based on this type of communication tactic. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we find permissive parents. Permissive parents exhibit a low demand tendency, and they exhibit a high responsiveness tendency. These are the parents that are the cool parents, whose kids can stay out late, they may allow parties to happen at the house, they're very forgiving of their children, and they make lots of excuses when the children make mistakes or do things that are not appropriate. So, permissive parents tend to be very accepting, they tend to be very non-punitive, or what non-punitive means is that they do not like to punish their children. So if their child ever does anything that is not acceptable, rather than punish them, they may just sit them down and try to have a conversation with them. They try to allow their children to explore themselves and also to express themselves in a natural and a real way. However, because of this permissive parenting approach, there are minimal rules in terms of norms for the family environment or rules in terms of how the child should behave away from the home environment. And permissive parents strive to try to use reason to influence their children, so they may try to discuss something logically with their children rather than taking away privileges or hitting their children. And an example of permissive parenting would be, for instance, in the previous situation that we used, if the same individual were to go out for the entire night, they might be met the next morning without any kind of confrontation from their parents, and in fact, their parent may not even be fazed that they stayed out the entire night. Now, although permissive parenting is very different from authoritarian parenting, permissive parenting is often met with less accomplishment among the children because there's less reinforcement at home. Also, children who have permissive parents sometimes report that they wish that there had been more structure in the home because they would see all of their peers have structure, and there was a part of them that realized that that was something that they needed. So the child development results for permissive parenting are not ideal. Around ages 2 and 3, we start to see that children who come from a permissive parenting home exhibit less self-control and less self-reliance. So they do not control their behaviors as well as their peers, and they are not as able to be reliant upon themselves as other children the same age. This is obviously because they have lowered expectations by their parents, and because the parents may be fairly tolerant and accepting about the children's behavior, children from permissive parenting homes tend to exhibit more conflicts at school, and in adolescence they tend to have lower self-esteem than their peers who do not have permissive parents. They also tend to have lower grades than their peers, and it's no surprise that children who come from a very permissive parenting home have lower academic achievement than peers that come from other homes where there is more of a strict ideal enforced. Interestingly, children from permissive parenting homes tend to actually have more conflict socially than children from other homes. So although they live in an environment that is fairly open-minded and accepting, it seems as if this open-mindedness does not help them in terms of their future interactions, because the low expectations with which they were raised may actually contribute to these children being not socially appropriate. Perhaps they don't follow certain rules that they should be following because their parents allow them to do whatever they feel like. So although permissive parents are high in warmth and low in expectation, they do not produce the ideal child development, and it is not a benefit for children who tend to come from these homes. Authoritative parenting is the third style of parenting, and authoritative parents tend to exhibit a high demand and high control, but they also exhibit high warmth and high responsiveness as well. There are very clear rules that are established with children who come from authoritative homes. These rules are regulated, and children learn that they will be monitored, and that if rules are broken, that there will be punishment implemented. And when punishment is implemented, typically it is used through a type of reasoning. However, there may also be taking away of privileges and things like that. In authoritative relationships between parents and children, there is usually a verbal give and take. So unlike the authoritarian parents, authoritative parents genuinely care about what their children are thinking and feeling, and they seek out the ideas of their children when they are having conversations about important issues. Authoritative parents strive to instill within their children the ability to be autonomous and to have a defined sense of self-will. And they also strive to implement their children with a value to be disciplined, to conform to various rules, regulations, or types of conduct that may be expected of them. So, for example, if you have a child who tends to drive the car until they run out of gas, and then you have to pay a tow truck to pick up the car, and then you have to put the gas in the car, or you have a child who does not maintain their car, if let's say they're a teenager and they don't maintain their car appropriately, and they blow a gasket, which I believe is an example that we read about in this chapter with Beth's stepson. And so if you have a child that is not appropriately maintaining their car and the car breaks, then clearly they can lose their car because it's going to cost a lot of money to fix a car that has not been maintained and has broken as a result of that. So in this way, the parents are both taking away the car from the teenager, but in doing the taking away of the car, they use a sense of verbal reasoning by discussing the fact that the reason that they're taking away the car is because the teenager did not conform to the expectations that were laid out when they started driving the car and when they bought the car. So because of that, they would have to earn the money to fix the car until they could have the car again, so that they would learn how to be a responsible automobile owner. Authoritative parenting has been shown to be the most ideal for children in terms of their physical, social, emotional, and intellectual outcomes. So, for instance, by the age of 2 or 3, research suggests that children who come from authoritative homes are more content than their peers who come from other types of parenting homes, and they tend to be more assertive than their peers. They also exhibit a tendency to explore their environment more, and they are also more likely to have defined social interactions with their peers that are positive. In adolescence, children who come from authoritative parenting homes tend to exhibit higher self-esteem than their peers, and they also tend to do better in terms of their grades. In general, children who come from these homes are more achieved in terms of their external accomplishments, and they are also more intrinsically motivated, meaning that to them, accomplishing goals gives them an internal reward. So they feel good about themselves, they feel like they are someone who can take care of business, and somewhere along the way, authoritative parents instill that intrinsic motivation into their children by giving them the high expectation that you expect your child to perform, and then when the child does perform, you meet them with a high warmth and a high responsiveness, which makes them feel very good about their performance. So basically, authoritative parents tend to exhibit the most ideal outcomes for their children in terms of the self-esteem for the children, their achievement. Authoritative parents tend to have children who have higher grades, and they also achieve more in terms of their careers and education. The self-esteem of children from authoritative parenting homes tends to be high, and they also tend to be more adjusted socially than their peers. One style of parenting that is not mentioned in your textbook is that of neglectful parenting. This tends to be a fairly small proportion of the population. However, it is something that we should discuss. Neglectful parents tend to exhibit very low demands and very low responsiveness to their children. These kinds of parents are typically not very engaged with their children. They are also not very involved in their children's lives. Oftentimes, neglectful parents may work for many hours of every day outside of the home. Perhaps they may not be there intellectually or emotionally because they have an addiction problem or because they are depressed. So these parents are really not engaged in their children's lives, and clearly this type of parenting style is not ideal for child development. Neglectful parents tend to provide for the basic physical needs of the children. So for instance, children from these homes usually have enough to eat and may have clothing or a warm place to sleep. However, they do not provide the necessary emotional support that children need for optimum physical, emotional, and intellectual development. Children from neglectful parenting environments tend to be emotionally withdrawn. During adolescence, they tend to be very delinquent and do not exhibit respect for authority or for rules and regulations. They also tend to be late and demonstrate this kind of lack of concern for regulations. So clearly this is not the ideal parenting situation. One of the main things that parents do in terms of their communication with their children is the communication of expectations. In the literature on expectation communication, we know about issues related to mastery orientation and learned helplessness. Mastery orientation deals with a child's ability to take on tasks or accomplishments that they need to do in order to be successful in life, and deals with their ability to successfully achieve these types of goals that they may assume. So, for instance, if we teach our child to have a good sense of mastery orientation in life, we teach them that they are able to successfully accomplish school tasks, they are successfully able to have relationships with people, and if they have challenges in those relationships, we teach them how to resolve them so they can successfully continue relationships. So in general, the idea is that it is much better to instill our children with a sense of mastery orientation than a sense of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness takes place when children learn that they are not able to accomplish things without the help of someone else or without the aid of someone else. Learned helplessness takes place when parents train their children that the children absolutely need the parents to accomplish anything in life, and in fact, that if the parents are not involved, then the child may have a difficult time accomplishing anything. Also, if parents do not encourage their children to accomplish things, and if parents do not provide the necessary resources that children need, they may also be promoting a sense of learned helplessness. So for instance, if your child comes home and they have gotten a D on their math exam, and you say something to them like, "Oh, well, I suppose math is just not your area," then that trains your child that it is acceptable for them to deal with a failure as something that is just not their area. And basically it dismisses it, and it allows them to feel that they are helpless in terms of being competent to accomplish something. So if you were going to try to instill within your child a sense of mastery orientation, if they came home with a math exam that had a D on it, what you would do is you would say, "Okay, so what seems to be the problem with the math? Do you need a tutor? Do you need to spend more time doing it? Would it help if I sit down and do it with you?" So you can talk with your child about how it is that they can do a better job with their math rather than just accepting the fact that they are not that particularly good at math. So in terms of communicating expectations, the first step in this process is input, and this is the information quantity that we discuss with our children, and of course the complexity of the issues that we discuss with them. In terms of output, we can look at mastery orientation from the quality of a child's development in terms of their physical development, their emotional, their intellectual, and of course their social development. Generally speaking, authoritative environments tend to produce children that are more healthy than children that are in other environments. And as a review, the authoritative parenting style is the style that includes a climate that is both warm and also demanding. And as research has suggested, children who come from authoritative parenting homes tend to have better grades, they tend to have more intrinsic motivation. Another component of the communication of expectations perspective is the idea of feedback and attribution. And what's interesting about feedback in terms of communicating expectations is that the most successful outcomes for children tend to be ones where we make internal attributions for a child's success. So for instance, if your child does a really great job on an exam at school, you might say something to them like, wow, you're really smart. Good job. Or something like that. On the other hand, the mastery orientation perspective also has found that when our children do not succeed, we can discuss that through making external attributions. So for instance, if they come home and they've taken a test and they do very terrible on the test, you could say something like, oh wow, that test must have been really hard. Or maybe you just need to study a little bit longer next time. So these are some of the issues that can influence whether your children develop a sense of mastery orientation and learn helplessness. Obviously, if you give your children the right amount of information quantity about the important issues that they need to know about in life, and you discuss with them the complexity of these issues, you will be giving them more of an opportunity to develop mastery orientation than if you discuss minimal issues with your children, do not train them how to deal with challenges, and do not train them that if they are having a problem that they can get resources or assistance to help them through it. Another theory that looks at communication with children and parents communicating with their children is that of learning theory. And learning theory suggests that when we reinforce certain behaviors, then we tend to strengthen the tendency that that behavior will take place in the future. So for instance, when your child does something that is positive, so perhaps they bring home a great report card or they get a good grade on a test, then you would want to reinforce positive behavior by using a positive response. So good job, nice work on that. However, in terms of a negative behavior, what you would want to do would be to remove any kind of stimuli that may be aversive. So for instance, if your child brings home a negative exam or a bad grade, what you would do instead of saying good job would be to say something like, well, it seems as if you've probably been spending too much time watching TV and playing video games. So until you get your grades back up, you are not able to watch TV or play video games. Or you can significantly reduce the amount of time that they're able to engage in these activities. And so this would be an example of a negative reinforcement, basically where you're removing an aversive stimuli, and in the case of grades in children, obviously television and video games can be a negative stimuli for grades. So when we want to stop certain behavior, then we tend to use punishing behavior, and you may actually have two different types of punishment taking place, and these are natural consequences and logical consequences. Natural consequences are the direct and the contingent effects of a certain behavior. So for example, if a child leaves their skateboard or their bike outside in the rain, the wheels will indeed start to rust. So the natural consequence is the outcome, which is a direct result of the behavior. So the outcome would be rusted wheels, and that is a result of the behavior of leaving your bike or your skateboard in the rain. Now, logical consequences are often developed or applied by parents in order to prevent natural consequences from taking place. So for instance, if you have a rule that your child must not touch the stove to prevent them from getting burned, and you see them reaching up towards the stove, then you might actually punish them with logical consequences, and you might tell them, okay, you have to go sit in timeout, or whatever the punishment might be. And basically, the logical consequence that you are evoking is to prevent the natural consequence of your child getting burned from taking place. Control and discipline are essential parts of being a good parent. And as we've been talking about, control and discipline are very important in terms of training our children to learn how to respect rules and authority systems. And what we find in terms of the research is that during the time of adolescence, that children tend to have much more conflict with their parents, and this is especially the case with female children. Part of this takes place because of the fact that children at this age are striving to be more autonomous and more independent. They may feel like they are an adult because they are growing and developing physically. However, mentally and emotionally, they are still considered to be a child by their parents. And so this striving for independence can cause conflict in the home when previously they had been much more dependent upon their parents. At this age, we also see that there are many taboo topics between parents and children in terms of what they discuss. So it's not surprising that communication regarding sexual experiences is most often avoided, and this was especially true with daughters and fathers and also between sons and mothers. However, adolescents also tended to avoid talking about dangerous behaviors, friendships, or other negative experiences with their parents. And consistent with research on parent-adolescent communication, adolescents tend to avoid fewer topics with their mothers than they do with their fathers. During this stage of development, there also tends to be less positive communication taking place in the home, and this is consistent with the fact that there is more conflict taking place with the child and their parents, given the struggle for autonomy and independence. Now, what's interesting about adolescents and the relationships they have with their parents is that the gender of the parent may actually mediate the way in which a child ends up perceiving their parent or ends up communicating with their parent. And so what they tend to find is that adolescent children tend to think of mom as someone who is more understanding, and so they may go to mom more when there's a complicated emotional situation they're dealing with or something that's difficult that they may be afraid to share with dad. They may talk to mom about topics that are considered to be taboo. And so these are areas where we can see that the gender of the parent may actually interact with the relationship that parents have with their children during adolescence. However, dad is seen as a primary source of information and a source of material. So for instance, if children or teenagers need to know about going to the museum and getting information for a book report, or how to seek out the information they need to build that science project, dad is the one that they tend to go to for that type of information and that type of material.